Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict by Medea Benjamin and Nicolas J.S. Davies. Preface by Katrina Vanden Heuvel. Narrated by Teri Schnaubelt. Preface. War is a tragedy, a crime, and a defeat. As Russia's illegal, brutal assault on Ukraine grinds on, the impact on the world is already profound. We are witnessing the emergence of a new political and military world order. Climate action is being sidelined as reliance on fossil fuels increases. Food scarcity and other resource demands are driving prices upward and causing widespread global hunger. And the worldwide refugee crisis, with more international refugees and internally displaced people than at any time since the end of World War II, poses a massive political and humanitarian challenge. Meanwhile, the war is diverting donor money from other global crises, reducing the U.S.'s and Europe's ability to fund global development agencies facing food and fuel price hikes. Furthermore, the more protracted the war in Ukraine, the greater the risk of a nuclear accident or incident. And with Biden's strategy to weaken Russia with the escalating scale of weapons shipments, including the U.S. rocket system HIMARS and anti-ship missiles, the revelations of U.S. intelligence assistance to Ukraine's military and the presence of special ops in that country all make clear that the U.S. and NATO are in a proxy war with Russia. Shouldn't the consequences and human, economic, and strategic costs of this proxy war be a central topic of informed analysis, discussion, and debate? This primer by Medea Benjamin and Nicolas Davies is a needed and accessible contribution designed for those who seek alternative views, history, and context. For too long, those who have departed from the orthodox line on U.S.-Russian relations and, more recently, the Ukraine war, have been marginalized, slurred, even demonized. Those who argue that the West/NATO played a precipitating role in the Ukraine tragedy are not excusing or justifying Russia's invasion, they are raising informed analysis. Inevitably, the continuing conflict empowers war parties in both the U.S. and Russia, as well as that vestigial military institution NATO. Hawks and armchair warriors make a resolution of the crisis more difficult. The U.S. has so far dedicated $47 billion in weapons and aid to Ukraine since the invasion launched. That is almost as much as the entire State Department budget and more than the Biden administration is committing to address climate change. U.S. weapons conglomerates are lined up at the trough. Before the war ends, many Russians, Ukrainians, perhaps Americans, and soldiers/contractors of other nationalities will die, while Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and Northrop Grumman make fortunes. And, shockingly, after the media experience of the Iraq War, network and cable news is replete with pundits or experts, more accurately military officials turned consultants, whose current sinecures and clients are not disclosed to viewers. The U.S. urgently needs to focus attention and resources on the crisis posed by the pandemic, economic inequality, jobs and inflation, democracy imperiled, racial division, and catastrophic climate change. Instead, the security order that failed so catastrophically over the past few decades remains entrenched. Once more, America favors military presence over diplomacy, policing the world over rebuilding at home. The real and present dangers are slighted as resources and attention focus on great power competition. What's needed is a security architecture for a world the U.S. doesn't police, limiting, not intensifying, great power conflict. It may be hearsay inside the Beltway blob, but it's high time to admit that the post-Cold War international order, with the U.S. as the unipolar power, is deceased. Still, too many in this administration appear to equate diplomacy, negotiation, and compromise with appeasement and capitulation. It has been reported that Secretary of State Antony Blinken has not spoken to his Russian counterpart about well, anything since the beginning of the war, the White House seems so diplomacy-averse that it's prepared to tolerate hardship at home. In a July interview, Biden's top economic advisor was asked what he would say to families who couldn't afford increasing gas prices resulting from the Ukraine war. He responded, "This is about the future of the liberal world order, and we have to stand firm." Humility, in short supply in D.C., might have led him to note that after the disastrous war of choice in Iraq, the U.S. is not exactly the exemplar of a rules-based order. Rather than building up weaponry in Europe, could the U.S. initiate negotiations about shared security, disarmament, and a military stand-down? Instead of escalating weapons shipments, could the U.S. wisely escalate diplomacy, including showing an openness to direct talks, new security arrangements, and signaling willingness to ease or end sanctions as part of a peace deal that preserves Ukrainian sovereignty and independence? Simply stated, an endless war in the heart of Europe does not serve the interests of either the Ukrainian, American, or global community. Katrina vanden Heuvel, July 2022. Introduction. Collision course. Exactly 1 week before Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022, we wrote an article exploring 3 possible outcomes of the crisis in Ukraine, predicting that an unprovoked Russian invasion seemed to be the least likely outcome. We obviously got that wrong. Whether the invasion was indeed unprovoked or not is one of the questions we explore in this book. But we were surprised, shocked, and horrified by the invasion, as you probably were too. Since then, like many people around the world, we have been trying to make sense of this crisis, to search for the truth through the blizzard of propaganda from all sides, and to understand how we and people of conscience everywhere can help the people of Ukraine restore peace to their country and their lives. We have both been writing about war and peace for many years. Since we started writing together a few years ago, we have written about crises provoked by war, militarism, and coercive relations between nations in almost every part of the world. These crises have left us pondering the huge gap between the technological progress in the past century, which has improved many people's standards of living, and the lack of progress on the existential and increasingly urgent challenges we face: how to live together in harmony on this finite planet, how to share its bounty to improve the lives of all, and how to safeguard the miracles of the natural world for a sustainable future. We humans have undoubtedly made a mess of the world, but in a strange contradiction, we also already know the solutions to most of our problems. Whether we are asking how we can provide health care to everyone, or how we can alleviate poverty and hunger, or how we can stop pumping carbon dioxide into the air and heating up the planet, the answers are there, sitting on the shelf, just waiting for us to collectively take them down, dust them off, and put them into practice. The obstacles to doing so lie in our political and economic systems, which prioritize corporate profits and the vested interests of wealthy people and powerful institutions over the things that would make life better for all of us. War and militarism are the ultimate example of this. We all agree that conflicts must be peacefully resolved at the negotiating table, and we have established that as the very foundation of the United Nations Charter. And yet, we end up spending trillions of dollars to build warships, warplanes, missiles, and other weapons that are meticulously and very expensively designed for only 2 purposes: to kill and to destroy. During the Cold War, the conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry gained precisely the unwarranted influence that President Eisenhower had warned against in his farewell speech in 1961. The end of the Cold War was a golden opportunity for the United States, Europe, Russia, and indeed the whole world to finally reduce military spending and reinvest our resources in building the better world we all know is possible. But the peace dividend that most of the world hoped for was trumped by a power dividend, as the U.S. military-industrial complex, NATO, and other Cold War institutions reinvented themselves to take advantage of the collapse of the USSR and expand their military dominance. The United States and its allies developed new rationales to use military force even more freely and widely across the world, leading to catastrophic wars in Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Lebanon, Palestine, Libya, Syria, and Yemen. Many of these military operations blatantly violated the UN Charter, which expressly prohibits the threat or use of force, except in self-defense, or when the UN Security Council authorizes its use, to restore international peace and security. But who was going to enforce the rule of international law when the world's sole superpower reverted to the law of the jungle, or might makes right? Meanwhile, Russia, the West's former Cold War nemesis, was subjected to economic shock therapy, the rapid privatization of its national resources and state-owned industries under the tutelage of Western neoliberal economists. That led in the 1990s to a near collapse of its economy, with a 65% drop in GDP and a reduction in male life expectancy from 65 to 58. It also created a new class of oligarchs, politically connected businessmen who became extraordinarily wealthy through a corrupt process of acquiring state assets. Vladimir Putin was appointed prime minister in 1999 and then elected president in 2000, positions he occupied alternately for more than 2 decades. He oversaw the restoration of the power of the Russian state and the recovery of the Russian economy, campaigning against corruption and selectively prosecuting oligarchs who opposed him. By the end of his second term as president in 2008, his government had cut the poverty rate from 30% to 15% and revitalized the economy, restoring Russia's GDP to its 1990 level. Putin rebuilt Russia's oil and gas industries with new pipelines and expanded exports to Europe and China. He remained hugely popular in Russia because he improved people's lives and restored Russia's economic sovereignty and its position in the world. From Gorbachev to Putin, Russia's leaders hoped to be accepted by the West as economic and security partners. Russia had its own problems with Islamist extremism and terrorism as a result of its savage wars in Chechnya between 1994 and 2009, and Putin's Russia cooperated with the U.S. war on terror. Russia did not interfere in U.S. wars and even provided logistical support and resupply routes for U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Not until 2007, at the Munich Security Conference, did Putin begin to publicly challenge NATO expansion and call for a more inclusive international security framework that should include Russia and China. In 2011, the United States and its allies began supporting and arming al-Qaeda-linked groups in Syria in a proxy war to overthrow President Assad, a close Russian ally. In its first military response to Western war-making, Russia intervened militarily to defend its Syrian ally. Putin worked with Obama to resolve the crisis over Assad's alleged chemical weapons use in Syria and facilitated talks with Iran that eventually led to the JCPOA nuclear agreement. But as we shall see, this nascent cooperation between Obama and Putin was undermined by events in Ukraine in 2014, a critical moment on the path to war for Ukraine, Russia, and the United States, and its Western allies. It was no coincidence that Ukraine became the crucible of the renewed Cold War between the West and Russia. While its capital, Kiev, along with eastern and southern Ukraine, were part of Russia and the Russian Empire for centuries, Western Ukraine was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 17th and 18th centuries, and was then divided between Russia and Austria in 1793. After the Russian Revolution, Ukraine was contested and fought over by a dizzying array of different forces, from Ukrainian nationalists and anarchists to White Russians and Bolsheviks, while Austria, Germany, Poland, Romania, and even France occupied and fought over different parts of it. Ukraine was not incorporated into the USSR until 1922. Ukraine again became a battleground between East and West in the Second World War. Ukrainian nationalist militias fought on the German side and took part in the mass killings of Jews and ethnic cleansing of Poles from Western Ukraine. As we shall see, neo-Nazi groups experienced a revival in Ukraine in the early 21st century and played important roles both in the 2014 coup and in the civil war in eastern Ukraine that followed it. Russian relations with Ukraine and the United States never recovered after the events of 2014, and in fact continued to deteriorate until February 24, 2022, when Russia jumped on the might makes right bandwagon by also tearing up the UN Charter and invading Ukraine. In our view, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was not only criminal, but also a catastrophic move and a terrible miscalculation. Veteran U.S. diplomat Chas Freeman called it the worst strategic decision that any Russian government has made since Tsar Nicholas II decided to go to war with Japan in 1904. But we also believe that the Western nations' treatment of Russia in the decades following the demise of the Soviet Union was a policy mistake of epic proportions. NATO expansion was a disaster waiting to happen, as seasoned politicians, diplomats, and academics warned. The people of Ukraine were unwittingly caught in a perfect storm, whipped up not only by brutal Russian aggression, but also astonishing Western hubris and stupidity. The result was what amounted to two simultaneous wars in Ukraine. One was the war that resulted from Russia's military intervention in Ukraine's civil war in February 2022, in which Russia was the aggressor. The other war being fought in Ukraine was a broader geopolitical conflict between the United States and NATO on one side and Russia on the other, in which the U.S. and NATO were the instigators and the more aggressive parties. Tragically, it was the Ukrainian and Russian soldiers, as well as thousands of helpless Ukrainian civilians, who pay the ultimate price in both these wars, while Americans and citizens of NATO countries lived in an illusion of peace, largely oblivious to their own government's share of responsibility for the crisis and the carnage in Ukraine. The complex nature of this conflict made it particularly confusing and difficult for the Western peace movement, and for people of conscience around the world to respond to. Embroiled in arguments about the culpability of the different sides, activists were left divided and unable to build strong popular support for peace negotiations. This left Western politicians facing little opposition as they undermined and rejected negotiations and flooded Ukraine with weapons that were bound to prolong and exacerbate the war. In this book, we have tried to clear up the confusion. We have explored the history of Ukraine leading up to this crisis, but also how the United States, Europe, and Russia became involved in that history as a result of their tragic and ongoing collective failure to make good on the promised post-Cold War peace dividend. We have tried to answer a range of key questions people have asked since the invasion. What happened in Ukraine in 2014? Was there really a coup? What role did the United States and Russia play in those pivotal and complex events, which Western corporate media deceptively abbreviate as the Russian annexation of Crimea? Why did civil war break out in eastern Ukraine in 2014? What was the 2015 Minsk II agreement? Why and how did it fail to end the civil war over the next 7 years? How did that set the stage for the Russian invasion? And why did Russia decide to invade Ukraine? How important were provocations by the West? Don't Ukrainians have the right to join NATO if they want? And are neo-Nazis a powerful influence in Ukraine, or just a red herring? Also, how did NATO, a military alliance built to defend Europe from attack by the USSR, outlive its purpose, expand beyond its borders, or any borders at all, and end up invading Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, and Libya, all a long way from the North Atlantic? How did that affect Russia's view of NATO expansion? Back here in the United States, are the corporate media telling the truth about this war, shaping their own narrative, or just repeating government propaganda? What are the Russian people thinking, and how do Western sanctions affect them? What about the impact on the rest of the world? And is there really no way to end this war peacefully? Who and what are holding up diplomatic talks? How close are we to a nuclear war? Most importantly of all, what are the possible solutions? OR Books asked us to write this short primer to help you, the reader, to make sense of how the world came to this dire circumstance in 2022 and how we can move forward from here. We wrote the book in record time, 2 months, without knowing how the war would evolve or how it would end, but with the knowledge that the consequences of this tragic conflict will likely be with us for decades. This makes it all the more urgent to break through the web of confusion and find solutions. We hope our analysis will help you start to make some sense of this brutal and senseless war. 1. How 2014 set the stage for war. When the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, broke up in 1991, administrative borders between its republics became international borders between newly independent nations. This created predictable problems in several of the new countries. The majority Armenian population of the mountainous Nagorno-Karabakh region found themselves marooned inside Azerbaijan, while the largely Russian population of Ossetia found themselves split in two between North Ossetia, now part of Russia, and South Ossetia, within the new border of Georgia. Another Russian enclave, Abkhazia, ended up entirely within Georgia. These anomalies led to repeated outbreaks of war and remain unresolved, frozen conflicts to this day. Azerbaijan launched a new assault on Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020 to recover territory in and around the Armenian enclave. Russia, which has had good relations with both Armenia and Azerbaijan, brokered a ceasefire and dispatched peacekeepers to the new de facto border. In Ukraine, the first disagreements were over the status of Crimea, which had been part of Russia since 1783. Crimea was transferred administratively from the Russian Soviet Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic in 1954, after Nikita Khrushchev, who was from Ukraine, succeeded the late Joseph Stalin as Soviet leader. After the Ukrainian parliament voted for independence from the Soviet Union in 1990, Crimea held a referendum in January 1991. More than 94% of its people voted for independence from Ukraine, and Crimea briefly became an autonomous Soviet republic within the USSR. But when the Soviet Union finally broke up later that year, Crimea's parliament agreed to join Ukraine, overriding the expressed will of the large majority of its people, until the issue came to the fore again in 2014. The 1990s were a difficult time for the successor states of the Soviet Union, made much worse by Western-inspired economic shock therapy that imposed mass privatization of state-owned industries and national resources, and slashed public sector services and employment. As a result, Ukraine suffered runaway inflation and a 50% reduction in real GDP, leading to a decline of 3 years in average life expectancy. Just as in Russia, it also spawned a corrupt class of oligarchs who amassed their wealth by scooping up state-owned assets. After 2000, Ukraine's economy began to improve, but President Leonid Kuchma, who served 2 terms from 1994 to 2005, was mired in corruption and scandal. In the Tapegate scandal, he was actually caught on tape ordering the kidnapping of a popular anti-corruption journalist, Georgy Gungadze, who was later found dead and beheaded. Kuchma denied involvement in Gungadze's murder, but his approval rating fell below 10% by the end of his second and final term as president in 2004. The oligarchs divide Ukraine. The 2004 election was the first act in Ukraine's tragic and fateful division between Western and Russian-backed political leaders and parties, which ultimately set the stage for war. In the running was Viktor Yanukovych, the former governor of the eastern province of Donetsk, who served as prime minister under Kuchma from 2002 to 2005. Yanukovych was the political godfather of the eastern oligarchs who control the traditional heavy industries of Donbass and Ukraine's economic links with Russia. As prime minister, Yanukovych maintained Ukraine's close economic ties with Russia, but was also negotiating to join the European Union. Although he opposed NATO membership, he approved sending Ukrainian forces to take part in the U.S. military occupation of Iraq, during which 18 Ukrainian soldiers died. Yanukovych's opponent in the 2004 presidential election was pro-Western Viktor Yushchenko, another former prime minister from 1999 to 2001. Yushchenko was the governor of Ukraine's central bank during the Western-backed privatization of the economy in the 1990s. but he campaigned on a promise to stop the plundering of the state and imprison the looters. It was a dirty campaign in which Yushchenko almost died when he was poisoned with dioxin. In the first round of voting he gained a slight lead, but Yanukovych was narrowly declared the winner in the runoff. The country was now sharply divided along regional and ethnic lines, with Yanukovych winning in the Russian-speaking east and south, while Yushchenko won in the Ukrainian-speaking west and north, including Kyiv. Yushchenko challenged the result, supported by the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and Western election observers. The United States and the European Union refused to recognize Yanukovych as the winner, while Russian election observers and the Russian government endorsed the result. Yushchenko's supporters took to the streets of Kyiv in what became known as the Orange Revolution, the color his campaign used, and Ukraine's Supreme Court quickly threw out the results and ordered yet another round of voting. Yushchenko won the rematch by 52% to 44%. But within months, like Kuchma, Yushchenko was widely accused of corruption. He fell out with his Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko and fired his entire cabinet. In 2006, the flailing Yushchenko appointed his former rival Yanukovych as Prime Minister in an effort to save his job and unite the divided country. By the time Yushchenko ran for re-election in 2010, the disillusioned supporters of his Orange Revolution had deserted him, and he received only 5.5% of first-round votes. Yanukovych and Tymoshenko won the most votes and progressed to a runoff, which Yanukovych won by 49% to 45%, leaving the country still deeply divided along exactly the same east-west demographic fault line as in 2004. Yanukovych promised to heal the divisions between eastern and western Ukraine and prioritize joining the European Union, EU, while still maintaining close relations with Russia. In a newspaper interviewed as a presidential candidate, he said, "It's certain that Ukraine was and will be a non-aligned state. We strive neither to join NATO nor the CSTO, Russia-led Collective Security Treaty Organization. We'll maintain a neutral status." But Yanukovych was as corrupt as his predecessors, or even more so. The web of corruption he built, along with his two sons, became known as the family. By 2013, his son, Alexander, formerly a dentist, was running a business empire worth $500 million, built on the family's ill-gotten gains. Yanukovych brazenly built himself a palatial mansion outside Kyiv on a 350-acre estate he acquired in an illegal land privatization scheme. The estate included a golf course, a private Orthodox church, a museum for his classic car collection, and a pirate ship on the river where he held lavish parties. In a parliamentary election in 2012, Yanukovych's Party of the Regions retained narrow control, but that election also saw the rise of Svoboda, Freedom, a neo-Nazi party. It ran on explicitly Ukrainian nationalist, anti-Russian rhetoric that resonated strongly in Lviv and western Ukraine. Svoboda won 37 of the 450 seats in parliament and gained more than 10% of the popular vote, including 38% in Lviv province in western Ukraine, which had the highest turnout in the country. At the time, the rise of Svoboda shocked Western observers, and the European Union condemned it and urged other parties not to work with it. But only a year or two later, when Svoboda took a leading role in the Maidan protests and the overthrow of the Yanukovych government, Western governments and media downplayed or even denied its neo-Nazi ideology. Ukraine was not only plagued by the rise of the extreme right, but by endemic corruption. This reduced its national politics to a competition between factions of its post-Cold War oligarchy who vied for votes on an increasingly regional and ethnic basis, and helped themselves and their patronage networks to the spoils once elected. As in Russia itself, the shock therapy of post-Cold War neoliberalism had produced an extreme form of U.S.-style managed democracy in which political power was a function of the economic power of the corrupt ruling class. This endemic corruption was a constant obstacle to Ukrainian membership in the European Union. Yanukovych hoped to cement an agreement that would lead to EU membership, but he was also ready to join the Eurasian Customs Union, ECU, a free trade agreement between Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. Negotiations with the EU became deadlocked after a Ukrainian court prosecuted the former Prime Minister, pro-Western Yulia Tymoshenko, on corruption charges. Tymoshenko was convicted and sentenced to 7 years in prison.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?